And this is a terrorist tactic. The Zealots, or another group, an offshoot called the Sicarii means little knife. But the Zealots or the Sicarii would pull out a knife and they would cut off the body part of a priest. Because the Bible says that if you're missing a body part, you can't serve in the temple. So they, and that's the Zealots, they were terrorizing the priesthood in Jerusalem. Okay, folks, we're back at it again. It is a new year, 2025, and January 13th, 2025, and we're going to continue on through the Gospel of John. Now, this next section that we're going to be looking at in the text, it's John 1, 43 to 52, and we're going to have to cover a lot of ground in this section. And it's going to take multiple lessons to get through it because there's a lot of complexity to everything. And we're going to have to unpack it systematically. So overall, I think you can see that John is a deep book. And every place that he can be, he's using language or symbols or the way he tells the story that he's then operating below the surface meaning. And by doing this, one, he can pack a lot of information into this story because it's like building vertically instead of horizontally explaining everything. But it helps his audience gaze deeper into this mystery of Jesus as the Christ. And so when you go deeper like this, and it does take a little bit of work, we're going to try to get to whatever kind of bottom we can, if that's even possible. I don't think it is. But I think you'll see that as you go deeper into John, there's a more profound lesson than maybe we've gotten in the past. So this is still going to be a bit of introduction to the entire Gospel of John. And one thing that I haven't covered is the geography of the land of Israel. This is going to be integrated into John's message. So what was going on in the first century? Who were the people groups? Where did they live? Okay, and we're going to do that today. Now, this section of John happens to have the story of Nathanael. And Nathanael is under a fig tree, and we need to decipher this meaning. There's endless speculation about this story. So what I did was I created this image here, and it's depicting a group of disciples studying under a fig tree, and I'll show you where that comes from. And then Jesus is going to call them to follow him. So that's part of the story, but we'll get to that as we move along. Just a reminder, I've been putting together notes on these because of the amount of information that is being conveyed by John. It's a really good idea. If you download these notes, it will definitely help you because of the amount of information. So then you can refer back to them, you can reflect on them. I put hyperlinks in the PDF, so if you have it on your computer, you can hyperlink directly to the source that I'm pulling from. And I think that'll help you gaze a little bit deeper into what John is telling us. Okay, so today, John, geography, and the Jews, and you can see that I put the Jews in scare quotes, and I did that for a reason, and this is something that I've been needing to address, and this is tragic, unfortunately for the Gospel of John, that we have a word here that ends up being translated the Jews, and over the years, John's Gospel has been interpreted that this means all Jews everywhere at all times, and particularly when they're opposing Jesus. And this, of course, has led to the justification that you can persecute the Jewish people. Now, the problem is Jesus was Jewish, and all of his disciples are Jewish, all of the original followers are Jewish, It's a Jewish Messiah that they're looking for. So everything about it is deeply within the context of Judaism. And so what we're going to see, and scholars have now recognized this, is that when John talks about Jesus being opposed by the Jews, what we're going to see is that he's actually pointing to a specific group within Judaism in the first century. And so, depending on the book or the translation you're looking at, many scholars will say that we should be translating this as Judeans. And those are the ones that live in the south in Judea, temple-oriented, not Galileans like Jesus is. But if you happen to find it up in Galilee, then these are like the people in Galilee who support the temple authority. So now you do have, down in Judea, like the Dead Sea Scrolls are written by a group called the Essenes, and they oppose the temple. They're not in agreement with the temple. So Judaism is not monolithic. The Jews should not be read monolithic. And it's important to understand that we don't end up with the idea that all Jews oppose Jesus, which is simply not true, but that has been propagated throughout church history. So, okay, let's keep going, and I'll show you that. I think it'll become clearer as we move along in the text. The section is John 1, 43 to 52. We're only going to look at one verse today, but we will cover the rest in the next few weeks. Now, in this section, we're going to be introduced to the next two disciples. That's Philip, who's also from Bethsaida, and then Nathanael, who John tells us later in his gospel, John tells us later that he's from Cana. And that's going to become important. Now, Cana is the way we say it anglicized. If you're speaking Hebrew, Cana. That will be important. But that's a small village in Galilee. I'll show you on a map, and it's near Nazareth. And then I also mentioned that there's this reference to the fig tree and Nathanael. We're going to be digging into that conversation that's taking place between Jesus and Nathanael, because you could describe that as some kind of, let's say, rabbinic dialogue. Now, that's not any official term, but this is a type of inside baseball. If you've ever heard two people who are really into baseball talk, and they're using all kinds of acronyms and sayings, if you're on the outside of that, you don't know what they're talking about. I mean, you find the same thing, anything specialized, right? Pilots, doctors, maybe engineers, anything in a specialized field, they can have these conversations where if you're not in that field, you're not going to know what they're talking about. And this is what's happening between Jesus and Nathanael. So let's look at the very first verse of this section, and we're going to break this verse down, okay? So it says, the next day Jesus decided to set out for Galilee. Finding Philip, he told him, follow me. Now, what do we notice here? Well, we notice right here, set out for Galilee, which means he's not in Galilee. So the question is, where was he? Where was he geographically? In fact, where have all of these initial events taken place? Where was John baptizing? Where did Jesus pick up his initial disciples? And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the land of Israel in the first century. How was it divided? Who were the different people groups? Who had authority? Right? Who was in charge? And then we're going to add to that, and this is most important, who were these people opposing Jesus and why? Okay? So we're going to start by looking at a map of first century Israel. And so we go to this map, and just as a way of orientation, Israel runs north to south. It's about the size of New Jersey. To the west is the Mediterranean Sea, right here. On the eastern side of Israel, you have the Dead Sea. Okay? That's just to the east of the mountains where Jerusalem is. So I'm going to put this blue star there. That's where Jerusalem lies, up in the mountains. And then in the south, where that star is, where Jerusalem is, in Jesus' day is known as Judea. Now, without going into too much of the history here, when Jesus was conducting his ministry, Judea was governed by a representative of Rome, and that's Pontius Pilate. Now, the Jewish law of their day, because you have the Roman law, but then you have Jewish law, they're governed by the temple authorities, so that's the Sadducees and the Levites, as well as a group called the Sanhedrin. But this is seen as the seat of power for Israel due to Jerusalem and the temple. It's that epicenter for the Jewish religion. But if you don't live there, many groups don't always agree with what's going on there. Now, that's in the south. Now, if we move north, you can see north on this map, at the top, you have the Sea of Galilee. And of course, that's where most of Jesus' ministry takes place. And this region is called Galilee. Now, Galilee sits to the west of the Sea of Galilee. Okay? Now, we'll get more into this in a minute. Now, this is where Jesus is from. This is where Nazareth is. He lives then. He goes to live in Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. That's in the region of Galilee. And the ruling authority at the time of his ministry up there is one of the sons of Herod the Great. We know him as Herod Antipas. Now, I'm going to get to him in a second. But that's who's, at least on behalf of Rome, ruling up there. And then smashed right here in the middle, right, sandwiched in between them, is an area called Samaria. And the people who live here, the Samaritans. So, what is known in this point as Samaria used to be the northern kingdom called Israel in the Bible, or Ephraim. It gets really confusing. But anyways, this is the northern kingdom. Okay, so let me just clear the map here, and I want to look at these three regions. Just move the map over. So you have Judea to the south. This is the center of authority, dominated by the temple and Jerusalem, and the group that was in charge in Jerusalem, the Sadducee party. Now, that's the priestly party, the Levitical party. Now, in this scenario, we have these three separate groups. Who thinks they're in charge? Well, of course, Jerusalem, because that dominates. That's where the temple is. They're the ones who at least attempt to govern the worship of God. So that's the Sadducee party. So Judea, think temple-oriented, dominated by the priests. They're working closely with the Roman authorities to keep the people in line. Not always well-liked by the people. So when someone shows up who opposes the ruling class, well, the people of the land, those who are outside or not very near, they're called in Hebrew the Am Haaretz, which is the people of the land. They actually will like someone who stands up to the ruling power. And it's this area, the Judea and Jerusalem with the temple, that now scholars are saying this is what John is referring to when he says the Jews, for those who oppose Jesus. Because if Jesus is the Messiah of God, then they're going to have to listen to him. And so what you could do, instead of the Jews, as it refers, like a blanket, all Jews everywhere at all times, you could translate it Judeans, or even those who support the temple authority. So, for instance, let me show you an example here. If we go to John 1:19, I'll show you two, one from the ESV and the other one from the NIV. So this is when John is baptizing. And it says, and this is the testimony of John, when the Jews, so you see that phrase, the Jews, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" And that was a common practice. When a miracle would happen, or people were talking about something that was taking place in the countryside, those in Jerusalem would send people out to investigate. So now if we look at the NIV, they translate it a little bit different. Now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. So notice it's not just the Jews, like it's all Jews. They're saying we recognize that it's the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem who are really concerned about John's movement. Okay? So there's one example from the Gospel of John. Now let's go back to our map. So we have Judea in the south. Now if we move north, we've got Galilee. Well, just like we understand, I'm speaking in the United States, people can think back to the history of the United States and you'll understand something about the region you live in and all of the history that goes into that region that helps define the people. Well, in the first century, in Jesus' day, they all understand their history. So you have to think, well, who are the Galileans? Who were these Galilean Jews? Well, first of all, they're not temple-oriented, right? Because you can't, on a weekend, walk to Jerusalem. That's inconvenient. It's too far away. And so your worship tends to be focused on the local community, the synagogue. And many of these Galilean Jews, as we look at some of these little cities, these villages that had popped up very recently, like within 150 years of Jesus' birth, these were Jews who had immigrated back to the land of Israel from Babylon. So Israel was ruling themselves for a 100-year period, and many from Babylon who had stayed in Babylon decided, we're going to come back. Well, Babylonian worship is different than Judean worship. Because in Babylon, you can't get to the temple. So you have traditions like synagogue and rabbi. And when they move back to the land, then in 63 BC, Rome shows up. And of course, Rome showing up wasn't what they wanted. So what you get in Galilee, or you get these huge resistance movements to Rome. Many did not want to pay taxes to Rome. Many resisted Roman authority, and they would resist you if you were seen as going along with Roman authority. So you have a group up here in Galilee. Their worship style, now just think about that. They're worshiping the same God, but their worship style is different than Jerusalem. They're not temple-oriented. It's rabbi-disciple model. They're very often, this happens when you have the power base concentrated in one city, is they tend to look down on everybody else as uneducated. So the Galileans were considered uneducated by those in Jerusalem. They didn't necessarily see eye to eye with the Judeans and the temple authority. Okay, so that's important. We need to understand that so we can understand what's happening when Jesus is moving through these different regions. And then finally, let's go to the last one, Samaria. And of course, we all kind of know this, right? This is the home to the Samaritans. The Jews and the Samaritans did not like each other. It went both ways, but particularly Jerusalem and the temple authorities. Now, why? Well, because the Samaritans had their own temple to God on a mountain called Mount Gerizim. And they had a rival temple where they believed they were supposed to worship God. I mean, this is what's really cool. If you go to Mount Gerizim today, right, if you were to go to this upcoming Passover, the Samaritans that live there will actually be sacrificing a Passover lamb, just like it says in Exodus and Leviticus. Now, why? Well, because the Samaritans have a Bible. They have a holy book, and it's the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Now, it's not a 100% match. It's slightly different as it's been edited differently over the years, but scholars call it the Samaritan Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So they worship the same God as we do, but they do it differently. And these Samaritans, they're descended in part through the Jews from that northern kingdom, Israel. So they're connected to the Jewish people, but they're looked down upon by the Jews in Jerusalem because they're not a pure race. So we have three groups, and they all worship the same God, but they do it differently. They disagree on who has authority. Now, does this sound familiar? I mean, just look around the Christian faith. You know, what happened when Martin Luther protested? That's why we're called the Protestants, because we love to protest. After Martin Luther protested the Catholic Church, Protestants protested each other, and they're still doing it today. He protested the practices of the Catholic Church, right? He wasn't setting out to start a different denomination. He was setting out to reform the Catholic Church, just like Jesus is a reformer. He wants to reform Judaism, not start a whole new religion. Well, turns out when Martin Luther showed up, the Catholic Church, in Rome, they're not too interested in making reforms. So this is the same thing that's happening with Jesus. When you question those in power at the place of power, you're going to find resistance. So we have to understand this is not monolithic, and that's why it's so important that when you see Jews resisting Jesus, it's not all Jews. There's lots of disagreement here, and just like Christianity is not monolithic, neither was first-century Judaism. Okay, now we have to think. Let me switch gears a little bit, because at the same time you have these regions that are dominated by religion and ethnicity. You have to then think about Roman authority. Who's in charge when it comes to Rome? So we're going to switch to a little bit different map and think about who's ruling for the Roman Empire. So if you start down in the south, down at the bottom of the map, that's that red area. You have Jerusalem, and this is Judea. And then the governor, I've already mentioned, that's Pontius Pilate. He's appointed by Rome to be a governor because Herod, his name is Herod Archelaus. You find him in the book of Matthew. But he was removed. Not a good king. He was removed and replaced with a Roman governor. In Jesus' day, that's Herod Antipas. Or I'm sorry, that's Pontius Pilate. There's so many names and people going on, but sorry. Okay, now he ruled over both Samaria and Judea. So this whole section down here, that's Pontius Pilate. Okay, then we go to the north. And up here, you can see Galilee, and this is ruled by one of Herod the Great's sons, Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas is ambitious. He wants power. He wanted to be made king over the entire area that his father had ruled over. But Rome didn't do that. Rome divided it up. So he wants to be seen as a full king, and he's kind of moving in that direction. But if you notice his territory, it's divided. So it's the green. He has Galilee, and then he has the area down here called Perea. And so this is actually where Jesus' ministry is taking place. This is Nazareth. This is where Capernaum is. Antipas moved his headquarters to a very new town that he founded called Tiberias, right on the Sea of Galilee. So this is who Jesus is going to contend with during his reign, because again, you don't want to have anybody upsetting the power structure there in Israel. Now, the final one is one more of Herod's sons. His name is Philip. So if you look at this yellow region up here that's on the map, it's labeled Gaulonitis. This is where Herod Philip ruled. And one thing that's going to come into play here in a second is there's one group that lived, or at least was headquartered, inside Herod Philip's region, and they're called the Zealots. And this is going to be, the more you can understand about that Zealot movement and what's going on with Jesus' ministry, you will understand more about what Jesus is doing. So I'll show you closer in a minute. But let's go show you a little bit different map. This is Herod Antipas. This is from Wikipedia. This is his region, his territory. And if you zoom in to Galilee here, so he's ruling, you can see the Sea of Galilee. Here's where Jesus was inside of Herod Antipas territory. Here's Capernaum, where he ends up running his ministry out of, which is quite interesting because it's not in the middle of nowhere. That's in a thriving Sea of Galilee, lots of people. Herod Antipas puts his headquarters right at Tiberias. If Jesus really wanted to start a movement of peasants out in the middle of nowhere, he could have stayed in Nazareth. But he didn't. He went right down to where everything's happening, at least in Galilee. Last city I'll point out right here is Cana. And again, that's anglicized. We say Cana with a C, but Cana with a K. Okay. Then you can see how the map divides at the Jordan River. And over here, you have the city of Bethsaida. That's where many of the disciples are from. You have a city called Gamla. I'll point that out in a minute. That's the Zealot headquarters. And it's in a region that is called Batanea. Okay? Now this belongs to Herod Philip. So if we take a map, again, from Wikipedia, and you say, oh, this is Herod Philip's region that he rules over. His capital city is called Caesarea Philippi, which means Philip's Caesar or Philip Caesarea, named after the Caesar who gave him power. And if we zoom in again, now you see that you have Caesarea Philippi. Jesus went there. That's into the north. Here's Bethsaida. That's where many of the disciples are from. You have the region here is called Batanea. Okay? And then there's this city right here called Gamla, and that's the headquarters of the Zealot movement. And there's a reason why the Zealots are on this side of the Jordan River rather than in Galilee. And this goes back to their recent history. Herod the Great, that's the father of Herod Philip, and it's the father of Herod Antipas. When he ruled over Galilee, he drove those zealots out and across the river to a different territory. So now they stayed on that side of the river, and you see Herod Philip, he's not as ambitious as his brother Antipas. So the zealots didn't really have a problem with him, right? He was actually known as a good and reasonable king. Okay, now why am I telling you all this? Why do we need to know this? Why does this matter? Well, it goes back to that verse that we started with, the first verse of our section, where it says Jesus is leaving to go into Galilee, meaning he's not in Galilee. So the question is, where is he? Well, this is where scholars place him today. He's in this region right here, and it's a region that is called Batanea. John uses the word for Bethany for two different locations. One of them he qualifies with the phrase beyond the Jordan, Bethany beyond the Jordan. And scholars say that's Batanea, meaning John is baptizing and Jesus is calling his first disciples in this region, not in Galilee. So if we look at a verse from John, this is John 1:28, and it starts out, this is talking about all of his baptizing, right? It says, these things took place in Bethany across the Jordan. And then for years, scholars debated where that was. I mean, early Christians said, hey, there's nothing definitive. We don't know exactly where that is. But modern scholars today, there's a Bible software called Logos. They have a Bible fact book. If you read that fact book, it talks about that when he adds the across the Jordan to the word that we translate Bethany, he doesn't mean the Bethany down in Jerusalem, and that gets confusing. He's talking about the region of Batanea, that region east of the Jordan River. So right here. So the Gospel of John begins with John the Baptist baptizing in Bethsaida. He's east of the Jordan River. And it's a region governed by Herod Philip. It's also the region of the Zealots and their headquarters at Gamla. And you have Bethsaida, that's where those new people or the new disciples are mainly from, and then that city of Gamla. So John himself is from Bethsaida, this side of the river. Philip is from Bethsaida. Peter is from Bethsaida. And this becomes really important because we need to understand about the disciples and their actions later is they grew up around people who were zealous. And Jesus is calling people who understand that fierce loyalty to God. And it seems that many of these disciples had a zealot-type mindset. Because you get things like John and James, they want to call down fire from heaven on the Samaritans, right? Because the Samaritans are not hospitable to Jesus. Hey, let's just call down fire on them. The main one is Peter. Now, Peter, he pulls out a knife and he cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Now, a servant of the high priest happens to be a priest who's in line to possibly be the next high priest. And this is a terrorist tactic. The Zealots, or another group, an offshoot called the Sicarii means little knife. But the Zealots or the Sicarii would pull out a knife and they would cut off the body part of a priest. Because the Bible says that if you're missing a body part, you can't serve in the temple. So they, and that's the Zealots, they were terrorizing the priesthood in Jerusalem. And they're doing that in an attempt to influence them to stop collaborating with Rome. And so what you see from the disciples is a zealot-type mindset. Now, thankfully, what's going to happen is once they capture the message that Jesus is going to tell them about, that, hey, look, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. So you have to learn to forgive. They switch. And all that zealous energy goes into things like Paul says, be zealous for good works. Right? Jesus commands that we need to forgive. The Zealots did not want to forgive. Anyways, the point is, geography matters. It helps us understand at a deeper level who Jesus is interacting with, where his disciples are coming from, and their mindset. Now, wait till we get to Cana or Cana. So, it helps us understand who these people groups are and Jesus' message. Now, so what seems to happen is when we get to the verse here that's going to say 43, that's going to say, now Jesus decided to go into Galilee. All he has to do is cross that river, right? He's not making a long trek. He's moving from the Bethsaida side, where John is baptizing in that river, over to the Galilee. It's kind of like, going from Pennsylvania across the Ohio River and you're in Ohio. So governed by two different people, different laws. So it seems like that's what Jesus is doing. Because when he gets on the other side, he meets Philip, who also happens to be from Bethsaida. Okay, now, again, you might think, what are we droning on about? Geography, who cares? Well, there's a prophecy. And this is going to be my final note here. But there's a prophecy. It's a messianic prophecy, and it comes from Ezekiel. And it has to do with their history that they understand. And it has to do with that united kingdom of Israel coming back together just like they were, right? The kingdom was united under David and under Solomon. But after Solomon, the kingdom divides. And so what you get, the northern kingdom is called Israel, sometimes referred to Ephraim. Now that gets confusing because the prophets use both names. They'll switch them back and forth. But either way, that's the northern kingdom. Then you have kingdom of Judah to the south. Okay? And you have these two divided kingdoms. But there's a prophecy that we're going to see from Ezekiel. And this prophecy says that when the Messiah comes, he will unite these two kingdoms. He's going to unite them again, and God is going to reign over the entire nation of Israel. Now, it's Ezekiel 37:15-28. I'm not going to read all of it. I just want to show you the parts so you can understand the where Ezekiel is going with this, okay? So we're just going to look here. This is what Ezekiel says, verse 15. The word of the Lord came again to me, saying, now watch what he's going to do. He's going to use an object lesson for the people to understand what he's doing, okay? You, this is what verse 16 says, you, son of man, take one stick and write on it for Judah and the children of Israel, his companions. So that's for the southern kingdom. Then take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. Verse 17, and join them for you one to another into one stick. So what is God having Ezekiel demonstrate? That these two nations are going to come back together. Now, verse 22, here's what God says, okay? And I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. And who are they going to be ruled by? One king. And one king shall be king to all of them, and they shall be no more two nations. Neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms any more at all. Who's the king? It's Jesus. This is part of what John is telling us. That Jesus, as the Messiah, he's the Christ, the ultimate King of Israel. And all of Israel is going to come under his reign. So John's gospel is this story of a new creation. It's the dawning of a new period of time, a new creation. When Jesus, as the Messiah, just like Adam was supposed to be the original king over everything, Jesus is now the second Adam, the last Adam. He's going to be the king of Israel. And what he's going to do is bring together all of these people groups back under one reign. The Galileans, the Samaritans, right? Because they have the Bible as well. They're worshiping God. And the Judeans, they're all supposed to come under his reign. But if you don't want to give up your power, either you don't want to give up the power you have, say in Jerusalem, the temple authorities, or you don't like the type of... See, Jesus is now going to redefine the idea of having power. It's not having control over people, it's sacrificial power. So he's proposing a radically different type of power. Well, if you don't like the idea of forgiveness and sacrifice, well, then you're not going to go along with him. And this is what's happening as everybody's competing. They don't quite understand what Jesus is getting at. So this is part of the message that John is showing us. He's going to bring these three regions back together. That's why we do get much more of a focus on Samaria, like the woman at the well, chapter 4 in John, but not in the other Gospels. So if we go back to our map, this is where Jesus was when John tells us that he's going to Galilee. He's here in this region called Bethania. This helps us understand so many of those disciples are from Bethsaida. He's calling people from the zealot side of the river, and they have a passion to bring forth the kingdom of God. But Jesus needs to massage that passion, to not do it violently or through terrorist acts, but do it through forgiveness, sacrifice, and love towards one another. So much of the gospel message, Jesus as the king, one reign, is that we're all connected under one kingdom. So stop beating each other up. So when he goes to Galilee, he just crosses that river. Now he's in a different region. There's all kinds of implications to this that scholars love to debate. But that's really about how simple it is. So you have these three regions, Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Jesus is going to unify them as the King, as the Christ, under one rule. God will ultimately be their God, and the people will be under God's rule. Okay, and then you'll see how John is going to present this with that discussion between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Okay, so geography matters. Sorry for those people who are geographically challenged. If you don't like maps and all of that, yes, it can seem tedious, but it actually will help you read your Bible more informed. Who are these people groups? Who's opposing Jesus? Well, it's the Judeans, the temple authorities, those who don't want to give up their power. And lots of people in the land, remember, the people in the land loved Jesus and loved that he was standing up to those in power. Anybody who would stand up to authority, they like that. So the better we get at geography, the better we understand these little people groups and where they lived, the deeper you can go in understanding the message that John is telling us with Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the one who will reign over the entire nation and ultimately the whole world.